We are starting chapter 21. We are going to have one more chapter after this one, chapter 22, and then that is it for our summary of the Western world art history. So this is titled The Modern World, 1800 to 1945, and we will be covering several art movements during this lecture. So we're going to go through them kind of quickly. You want to pick up on the major characteristics of them, and you'll definitely want to get down the artworks as we've been doing all along, the artist's name, and hopefully you've been categorizing these by what time period they fall into. So we're going to talk about neoclassicism again. We already covered that in chapter 17, but we're going to go over it briefly again. And romanticism, because they kind of bleed together, as often art movements do. Then we'll talk about realism, impressionism, post-impressionism, America in the 19th century, Fauvism, expressionism, and cubism. Those are three separate art movements. Fantasy and futurism, Dada and surrealism, and then what they call between the wars, building new societies, which isn't really an art movement, but it's leading into the next phase of art. And these are shorter. So like where the Renaissance lasted a few hundred years or a couple hundred years, these are quicker. These sometimes only last 10 years. They're a faster change, and it just shows the modern world kind of changes faster, perhaps. And it's definitely influenced by history. So you can pay attention to what's going on in the world at these times, such as wars and things, and it really affects, or the Industrial Revolution, it really affects the art world as well. So we will jump in with some overview. Driven by technological progress and rapid changes, the 19th century spawned our industrial, modern, middle-class culture of mass production. It's a mouthful. Think about that again. The 19th century spawned our industrialized, modern, middle-class culture. And these are the things it has: mass production, mass advertising, mass consumption, and mass leisure activities such as shopping, entertainment, and visiting art museums. Art museums were developed in the 19th century, so this exact time period we're talking about. And that's just kind of the modern world. That's where we're at in Europe at this time, Europe and America. It's a focus on middle-class culture and in consuming and producing and lots of leisure time as life gets easier for people. So again, neoclassicism, which is what we've talked about already, is a style involved during Napoleon's empire and continued on after he fell from power. It was felt that great art could only be made from great subject matter like history and the Bible. And as we talked about last time in class, neoclassicism was really focused on patriotism, honor. It looked back to the old Greco-Roman style. And so this time we're not digging in quite as deep, but we're just going to look at some of the same paintings we've already looked at, a couple of new ones, and paying attention to the style, because really you can start to recognize neoclassicism just by how it looks. You're going to notice clear contour. So the edges of things are very clear and crisp looking. It doesn't look blurry, fuzzy. Clear colors, kind of vivid, bright colors that are very distinct. And precise draftsmanship, meaning it's drawn very accurately. Things are in good perspective and proportion. Realistic looking. We talked about last time that the human form kind of went back to idealized looking human forms. But we also talked about how they did. The only thing that was really different from Greek and Roman art is they made the faces look like real people. They didn't try to make them look perfect. So this is one example, obviously pulling heavy on Greek mythology. The title is Jupiter and Theseus. So this is by Ingrace, and this is kind of a real obvious example of neoclassic just by its style. We won't dive in too deep. Obviously, it's Greek mythology, and there's that whole moral meaning and ethical things going on as far as like what the gods allowed and didn't allow, the essence of virtue and love and all those things. But just technically speaking, just looking at it and analyzing it, we can see very sharp, clear lines. Edges are very clear. Look at the fabric right here. Look how clear and distinct every edge and fold is. Whoops, sorry. Look at the edges of his skin, just very distinct and clear. So it's in proportion. It's a difficult proportion because this is foreshortened. This thing down here, very in proportion in scale, perspective. Okay, so that's an example. And then this one is the ones we've looked at before from chapter 17. Same idea, very clear edges, not blurry, not fuzzy, drawn accurately. So the draftsmanship is drawn accurately. Things are in perspective and proportion. All of those types of things. Okay, and then we have, so just that's kind of a reminder back. That's where we left off, neoclassicism. But now we're moving on to this next art movement, which is called Romanticism. Romanticism, as you hear the word in there, has romance, romantic in it. The Romantic artists rebelled against the age of reason. And you might want to write that down under neoclassicism, that the way of thinking, or if you recall me telling you that, it was like the age of enlightenment, neoclassicism, and reasoning was very highly respected. It was all about what can we as humans figure out. Kind of going back to that way of thinking of the Greeks and Romans. This rebelled against that way of thinking, instead urging the use of emotion, intuition, individual experience, and imagination within artwork. So I don't know if you're noticing, but it's kind of like as we go along through history, one time period sort of rebels against the other time period. If everything was thought of one way in a period of time, and the art reveals that, then the thinking kind of shifts to the opposite. And it's kind of that way with trends and styles and all things in our culture. We get tired of one way of thinking. It's like a pendulum swinging. So where things are very controlled and reasoned and tight, then the pendulum shifts. Everybody gets tired of that, and the new way of thinking is this emotion, intuition, individual experience, and imagination. So that's the way people were thinking at this time, and the artwork shows that. Here are characteristics: glorified landscapes, picturesque ruins, the struggle for liberty, exotic cultures, and more subject is the subject is more important than the style. So it's a little less recognizable by style and more by what you see in the picture. Where neoclassicism, you can tell it's neoclassic just by the style, just by the way it looks. I mean, these are by two different artists and they look very, very similar in style. They look like they could almost be painted by the same artist. But Romanticism is going to have more variation in style, and more importance is the subject matter. So this first artist, Delacroix, is a well-known Romantic artist. The Women of Algiers, 1834. And this will be an example of the exotic. You'll kind of see some different examples of these characteristics. I'm going to click back. These 5 things listed here. This would be exotic cultures. So geographically, the closest exotic cultures to Europe were the Islamic lands of North Africa. To European thinking, these were part of, quote, the Orient, a realm imagined as sensuous and seductive, full of barbaric splendor and cruelty. Eugene Delacroix, the leading painter of the Romantic movement in France, spent several months in North Africa in 1832, fascinated by all he saw. He filled sketchbook after sketchbook with drawings, watercolors, and observations. Later, he drew upon that material to create numerous paintings, including the Women of Algiers, which portrayed three women and their servant in a harem, the women's apartment of an Islamic palace. So his style, as you can see, oops, I clicked over, sorry. His style, as you can see, is more painterly. Can you see a difference between that and the neoclassic style? It's more loose, you would say. We say painterly a lot when we mean loose or just not quite as clean edges. Do you see the difference? Painterly sometimes can mean you see the brush strokes a little bit more. They're more concerned about getting the feel for it and really painting it as they see it versus sort of a stiff, maybe it's mathematically accurate, but it's not as getting into the scene. Like painterly means you're really looking into the scene and painting it as you see it. So he worked from all those sketchbooks that he had collected when he was in Africa. So hopefully you can see a difference there in style. So these are a couple more examples of Romanticism, and you don't have to write down the names and titles of these, but I do want you to think about them because these are very good examples of the variety of different topics that we have. So the top one is Goya's execution of the 3rd of May, 1808. And that would be, clicking back to the list of topics, that would be the struggle for liberty, right? These people are, these Spanish people have been executed by French soldiers and they were just trying to be free. And then you have this one, which is titled, this is also Delacroix, by the way, Liberty Leading the People. A powerful image of war and just that trying to evoke emotion when you look at it, that you're see the struggle of the people, but they're fighting for freedom and they're tattered and some are dead, but they're right. This Lady Liberty is rising above with her flag. Also very painterly, right? You see, can you tell the difference? Both of these, Goya and Delacroix. It's not nearly as tight and clean lines as you saw with neoclassicism. And then this one is a good example of like the drama of overcoming struggle. This is a shipwrecked. This is the story of a shipwrecked boat, and these guys were all dying on this raft, and you can just see the struggle, and the people are dying and falling off of the raft. And way off in the distance, there's a ship. Will the ship see them? We don't know. But it's kind of, isn't it similar to this? Don't you see a similar theme of like, or I shouldn't even say theme, like one is fighting for liberty, one's fighting to survive, but they have like this almost like triangular composition, if you can see that. And then a flag being waved at the top on both of them. So I didn't really show you an example of glorified landscapes and picturesque ruins, but the struggle for liberty, exotic cultures, and just the struggle and the drama and sort of like heightened feeling and emotion in something. Those are all characteristic of the Romantic period. And I also oftentimes do assimilate that style of kind of looser, more painterly style. It's just such a big change from neoclassic, where it was so tight and so stiff and perfect. And these are just much looser, more blendy. The next art movement, so those are examples of Romanticism, and the next examples will be of Realism. The next time period is Realism. It was a reaction, shocker, against both Neoclassicism and Romanticism. How is it against both of those? Now we're going to do everyday and ordinary subjects, but done in a big, grand way, as if it's important. You have to admit, both the Romantics and the Neoclassics were showing imagery of dramatic, powerful, important things, right? Whether it's fighting for liberty, or the Oath of Harati, or the death of Marat, or the soldier being shot by Goya. All of those are very big, important subject matters, or even biblical themes. In neoclassic sometimes would be biblical themes. Big, important things. Now, realism is just like it sounds. Kind of like shrinking down to like boring stuff. Everyday events, not the big, extravagant moments of history, but just the ordinary things. However, done as if they were important. So Gustave Courbet is our artist we'll show for this art movement. And this is titled A Burial at Ornans, 1849 to 50. So we're halfway through the 19th century. And we have just a man who has died. The man, interestingly, we don't even know who he is. So that is not even the important thing. Ornans is the town where the artist had grown up. So, or perhaps it's Ornans. Courbet had grown up in Ornans, a small town in eastern France near the Swiss border. He came to Paris at the age of 20, and in a sense, he brought his town with him. The people he knew there, the lives they led, and the landscape of the region were the subjects of his art. In 1849, after one of his paintings was awarded a gold medal at the Salon, and by the way, a Salon, we'll talk about more as this chapter goes on. The Salon was an annual state-sponsored exhibition of new art in Paris, France. And so it was kind of a big deal. If you got into the Salon, it means you were somebody, or your art was important enough to show. It sounds like it would have been the coolest and the best of new artists, but it oftentimes would reject things that were too bold. It wanted new art, but it also wanted you to be like ordinary. So, but we'll talk more about the Salon as we go. So Courbet decided that it was time for something truly ambitious. He returned to his hometown and worked through the winter on his first monumental painting, this one you're looking at, A Burial at Ornans. The subject is a burial. We don't know who it is. Courbet uses the event as a pretext for a group portrait of Ornans society. A priest, two red-robed beadles, which are lay officials in the church, the mayor, a judge, male mourners, and a gravedigger have gathered around the open pit dug to receive the coffin, which is shown arriving at the left, which is over here, I guess. Although I don't really see it in this painting. But everybody's looking this way, so it must be arriving. A raised crucifix stands out clearly against the dull sky and distant chalk cliffs. Courbet persuaded the local authorities to pose for his painting. The mayor, judge, beadles, and priest are all portrayed as themselves. Courbet's friends and family are present, and most of the other figures have been identified as well. When the painting was shown at the Salon, a critic later recalled, it was as though a tornado had blown through the room. Admirers held that realism had produced the first masterpiece. So people who liked this style said, this is realism, this is real, and it has made its first masterpiece. But detractors thought that Courbet had pushed what they call called, quote, "The Cult of the Ugly," about as far as it could go. The painting offended them on two counts. The first was that it was the first was its resolute refusal to beautify or sentimentalize the scene. The second was its scale. Monumental formats were traditionally reserved for history paintings full of important personages. This painting was full of nobodies, taken seriously as people. The size was very big, 16 feet by 21 feet. So you can get a visual of that size. It's massive. That's really, really large. 16 feet. So that's twice as tall as a normal 8-foot ceiling. Twice as tall. That's huge. And so the people who liked it were like, it just clicked with them. This is real. We like this. But the people who did not like it said it's ugly and it's huge, and huge things are reserved for important things like biblical scenes or historical things. So it just kind of created a polarizing thing in the art world with this shocking rejection of both previous art movements. Okay, and then we move on to the next example. I told you they move quickly. There are lots of them and they switch fast. Manet and Impressionism. In the 19th century, the mark of an artist's success was acceptance into the annual juried salon. So to be juried means that you don't just go and show your artwork. You have to submit your artwork, people look at it, and determine if it's good enough to go into the show. In 1863, the jury rejected almost 3,000 submitted works. This caused the rejected artist and their supporters to mount a second official exhibition called the Salon des Refuses. A leader of the Impressionist movement was Manet. His painting, Luncheon of the Grass, is a touchstone for modern art. So we're going to look at the painting, Luncheon on the Grass. And the leader of the I reread that. A painting in the modern era could no longer be a simple transparent window on the world. It would also be increasingly conscious of itself as a painting. So I'll let you take a moment to copy some of that down, some of that information about what we're headed towards with this Impressionist movement, and the leader is Manet. And we will be looking at Luncheon of the Grass next. So it used to be that paintings were just sort of like a window to the world, as this says. Like you're just looking into time and space and what was going on. But now, as the quote says, it would also be increasingly conscious of itself as a painting. So we're looking at it now and we're thinking about it as a painting and what that means and what's acceptable and what's not, and how far can you push the boundaries of what art is. This is the beginning of that. And the beginning of the modern era. So where Courbet got into the salon, this group of artists, almost 3,000 artists, did not. And they decided to start their own salon, which is a pretty big deal. Okay, so this is the painting Luncheon on the Grass. It's usually translated. It shows a kind of outdoor picnic. Two men dressed in the fashions of the day, as you can see them, relaxed and chat in a woodland setting. Their companion is a woman who has, for no apparent reason, taken off her clothes. In the background, another woman, wearing only a flimsy garment, bathes in a stream. Manet seems to have wanted to accomplish two goals with this work. The first was to join Courbet and other artists in painting modern life. So can you see that connection? Painting just, average, everyday genre scene. But the other was to prove that modern life could produce eternal subjects worthy of the great masters of the museum. So that's pretty deep right there. Prove that modern life of the 1800s, could produce eternal subjects worthy of the great masters of the museums. His solution was to update two famous master museum-worthy paintings. They were Renaissance images, Titian, which we learned about Titian earlier, and Raphael. And I've put these two images on the screen here so you can see them and see where he's getting his idea from. The public saw what Manet was doing. The Titian, after all, was in the Louvre Museum, close by, and the Raphael was routinely copied by art students. They saw what he was doing, and they didn't like it. Surely Manet was making fun of them. In place of Titian's idealized and dignified nudes, he'd painted what seems to be a common woman of loose morals. Who else would sit there with no clothes on, meeting our gaze so frankly? So this painting by Raphael, as you can see, is of a completely different context. It's creating images of either biblical or mythological scene. I'm not even sure what it is, but it's not just an everyday event. And this one by Titian is kind of the same thing. It's not just an everyday scene, or not supposed to be just an everyday scene. It's hard to see much of a difference, but somehow the way this one is painted by Manet, the viewers were very much offended because it was like he was painting just these ordinary guys with this woman, and what is, it's scandalous seeming. Like, what are they doing? Why is she sitting there like that on this picnic? The men in the painting, too, were completely undistinguished. Not noble poets, as in Titian's, but ordinary students on holiday. One critic lamented that Manet was trying to achieve celebrity the easy way, by shocking his public. Others found the technique inept. Perhaps Manet would learn something about perspective and drawing, they said. His taste might improve as well. So, because these men are like poets and distinguished people, I guess it's considered okay for them to have women with them, but these are just ordinary guys. And so while it seems not shocking or strange to us, they all three look similar, right? We don't see a lot of difference other than there's people with no clothes, and that's shocking. It was, in effect, very offensive to people at that time in the modern era. So Manet's painting is odd, and art historians still debate just what he meant by it. In modeling his figures, Manet focused on the highest and lowest values, but eliminating the middle, transitional tones, meaning she's like so white, there's no she doesn't even hardly have any shadows on her. She's just very illuminated, almost translucent looking, where these black jackets and these shadows back here are just really, really dark. So it's like so dramatically contrasted, but not necessarily shadows, just sort of like big light areas and big dark areas. So there's like no transitional tones. As a result, the forms appear flattened, as though illuminated by a sudden flash of light. The perspective is off. Contemporary viewers were quite right. The bather is as far away as the rowboat, but if you could imagine her standing in it, you see that she is a giant. A giantess. So take a look back here. This lady back here, doesn't feel terribly wrong in size compared to the people in the foreground, but there's a boat right here that appears to be at the same depth as her in space, and if she were to stand in that boat, she'd be enormous. So the perspective is a little bit off. It's not quite right. It was evidently more important to Manet to have her form the apex of his triangle of figures than to place her correctly in perspective. Do you see the triangle of figures? This too flattens the painting, for the bather seems to move forward to join the rest of the figures, compressing the space between the foreground and the background. And it's because her size isn't very small and because her color is the same as this one, similar tones, you get the feel of a triangle here, but it also makes her feel like she's coming forward. She should be much smaller, and that would help her go back in space better. The spatial tension plays out in the landscape itself. On the left side of the painting, the ground recedes convincingly into the distance, but on the right side, there is no recession, just a flat, bright green. Nor do we believe for a minute that these people are really sitting outdoors. Clearly, they are posing in a studio. The landscape is painted around them like a stage set or a photographer's backdrop. Finally, the borrowed composition feels borrowed, as though it were in quotation marks. All of these qualities, the public scandal, the flatness, the artificiality, the ambiguity, and the self-conscious relation to art history, have made the painting a touchstone of modern art, which is why I'm going on so long about it, because it is a very important painting in art history, in terms of art history. It is a hinge on which modern art swings. A painting in the modern era could no longer be a simple transparent window, perhaps you've heard this quote, on the world. It would also be increasingly conscious of a painting as a painting. So I hope you can start to see what that is saying there. It's a big shift in how painting and art is viewed with this one painting and this changing of the art movement from the previous to now, the modern era, and Impressionism. So let's go ahead and dive into Impressionism. It won't all be this difficult to understand. That's a challenging painting to look at and to understand what that's saying, but if you were starting to just a little bit, you're successful. So now we're in what's called Impressionism. Impressionism aimed to capture an impression. Think about what an impression is, just the essence of something, right? Artists did not want to portray a literal landscape, but the sensation of a landscape. They used bright colors, brushstrokes, emphasis on light effects, on nature, everyday subjects, so again, just the normal everyday scenes. The new availability of portable tubed oil colors allowed artists to paint outdoors. Many Impressionists concentrated on light and the transitory nature of light. So this is probably an art movement that most people are familiar with. It's very popular because they're very beautiful and interesting to look at. It's just been, you see lots of posters made out of Impressionist paintings. In the galleries, art galleries, everyone goes to look at the Impressionism section. It's just well known, and they are beautiful and they are colorful. But we want to make sure we are recognizing what makes their style different. And yes, Manet was considered an Impressionist artist, but he's kind of at the forefront of it, and his don't exactly look like where we're headed. So we'll take a look at these. Jot down these characteristics of Impressionism. And here's our first artist, Berthe Morisot. And this is titled Summer's Day, 1879. And I think right away you see a big difference in style, right? Let's just click back and look at where we've come from. So again, Manet was the father of modern art. He's getting there. It's looser. The meaning is different. Realism was painting just what you see, ordinary things, right? Before that was Romanticism, which had a painterly look. It was looser, it was more, but more importantly was the subject matter than the style in particular. It was about freedom and exotic things, and looking at the list again, picturesque ruins, struggle for liberty, glorified landscapes. This is also Romanticism. And then remember, Neoclassicism before that. So I'm just trying to give you visuals to compare. Look where we've come to this. This is very, very loose. The artists are not concerned about hard edges or, in fact, they're intentionally making it so you see the brush strokes. They're not blending colors together. They're purposefully laying down colors of a chosen, they've mixed it, they've matched it, they paint it where they want it, and they just paint it as a brush stroke. They don't blend it in. So it feels almost unfinished sometimes. However, all the detail is there, is it not? All the feeling of where the sun's coming from, the colors are all there. It's there, it's just very loose and extremely painterly. Then I'll show you a couple more examples by some of the more famous Impressionist painters. This top one is by Renoir, with lots of people in there. Look at how the light, these artists were the masters of light and color. That's what they were looking at, was how light affects the earth and color. And where a lot of artists were painting from drawings and imagination, these artists were looking at real life and painting it. And if you notice, they had tubes they could take with them so they could paint outside. That was a new invention, tubes of oil paint. And then this lower one is by Claude Monet, not to be confused with Manet. There's a Manet, father of modern art, and a Monet. And he's perhaps the most famous and well-known Impressionist painter. Again, just people love these because they're so colorful. There's just beautiful color all throughout, but they're very loose. They're very expressive. Well, I shouldn't say expressive. They're recording what they see very carefully in color, right? But because of the looseness of it, it does feel expressive, but they're very much retained to what they're seeing, painting what they see, and they're very much painting at a certain time of day. It's not, well, this is what it kind of looks like out there. No, this is at 2:30 p.m., in the fall. It's a very specific time, and that's being recorded in that moment. So they also painted fast because they wanted to capture a certain time of day. Okay, post-impressionism. I guess I should show the video. This is a longer lecture today, but the video is still very helpful.
Okay.
One of the most significant movements for modern art is Impressionism. But did you know the word impressionist was first used as an insult? The term Impressionism comes from a scathing critique by Louis Leroy, which described one hated painting as a mere impression. The painting, referred to in this brutal review, was Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise. Impressionism was born during a time when the best-loved themes were religious and historical, and the French Academy of Fine Arts supported realistic renditions fervently. Landscapes and still-life pictures were deemed inferior, while portraits and historical paintings were highly prized. Young artists including Claude Monet, Pierre Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Frédéric Bazille differed significantly from the Academy in their views and artistic styles. One of these young artists, Edouard Manet, was a classically trained painter and studied with an established master, copying paintings at the Louvre. Manet experienced regular rejection from the French Academy and led impassioned discussions about the Academy's stifling traditional perceptions and practices. Little did anyone know that the Academy's rejection of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass in 1863, accompanied with a strongly worded missive, would spark off a revolution in the world of art. After more than half of the art pieces submitted that year were rejected by the French Academy, the public demanded to be able to judge the rejected work for themselves. In response to this public outcry, Emperor Napoleon III created the Salon of the Refused to let the public enjoy the rejected works. The Salon of the Refused exposed the world at large to the existence of an entirely new style and technique. In 1876, 3 years after the Salon's debut, Impressionism entered its age of glory, which would last until 1886. We now know how the Impressionist movement started, but what makes Impressionist art Impressionist? Impressionist art depicts a scene in the way as if the viewer might have only caught the scene with a glance. The paintings from this era are characterized by short brushstrokes that give the overall impression of the object or person rather than a finely finished and detailed work. Vibrancy is a critical aspect of the Impressionist canvas, and Impressionist artists ensured vibrancy through the use of dominant colors laid close together, unblended. Impressionist subject matter was as innovative as their technique. Deviating from the historical themes of the French Academy, many Impressionists painted contemporary scenes of urban life. One way vibrancy was depicted was in the play of natural light. Monet depicts natural light faithfully in his Woman with a Parasol. In this work, Monet captures his wife and son in an outdoor setting where the bright sunlight touches the top of Camille's parasol and the flowers beneath her feet tinge the front of her dress. The sheer life of the painting, the sense of open space and warmth of sunlight all combine to create a real-life scene for the viewer. All of this was achieved without the artist realistically finishing his central characters. Renoir was another Impressionist artist who chose to challenge the Academy with his depiction of risque and pretty maidens. Renoir and Monet together worked over a 2-month period where they perfected the style that would later be called Impressionism. During Renoir's early career, he had a passion for portraiture, which he carried with him even after his style grew more impressionistic. In fact, it is said that his success with portraits gave him the financial freedom to explore new techniques with landscapes and still lifes. Renoir's well-known Dance at the Moulin de la Galette showed his ability to communicate to the viewer a joyful and vivacious environment using a play of colors and subtle lighting techniques. The critics at the time were not happy with this work at all, though Dance at the Moulin de la Galette is deemed one of the best Impressionist masterpieces ever created. If you've ever seen depictions of ballerinas by Degas, you'll understand why he is known as the master when depicting the human figure in motion. He did not fully abandon the classical technique in favor of the unfinished style of rough and bold brushstrokes that the Impressionists favored. This was especially evident when it came to the clarity of outline and continuity of contours in his work. However, his style definitely took an Impressionist slant, and this is clear when you take a look at his later works that prominently featured ballet dancers. Degas, who's considered to be one of the founders of this complex era, actually rejected the term Impressionism and preferred to be known as a realistic artist. In the late 1880s, there was yet another revolution in the art world, where a group of young artists once again chose to adopt a style divergent from the popular Impressionist style. Paul Cézanne was the oldest member of this group of rebels, which included the likes of Vincent van Gogh and Gauguin. Known as a post-impressionist, Cézanne was doubtlessly inspired by the new style that Impressionism had given birth to. However, his inclination was to do away with the naturalism that Impressionists embraced. Symbolism was becoming the next big thing, although the style borrowed from Impressionist techniques quite heavily. Cézanne's work also differs from that of the early Impressionists by bringing a balance between the visual elements and the harmony of colors used. The Small Forest is one of his paintings that captures the essence of this Impressionist style perfectly, both in terms of showcasing his exquisite brushwork and his shift to a lighter, brighter palette to depict outdoor scenes. Cézanne's focus on creating structured paintings and carefully modulating color lay at the foundations for the revolutionary artistic style of Cubism. Outside of visual art, writers and composers experimented with Impressionist techniques as well. Charles Baudelaire's volume of poetry, The Flowers of Evil, inspired the symbolist movement in literature, which, like Impressionist artwork, communicated through non-formulaic impressions, with the goal of expressing the essence of a subject rather than reproducing it. Inspired by such poets, composer Claude Debussy deviated from the rigid formal structures such as the sonata and symphony in favor of less rigidly defined tonalities tailored to express the emotional themes of his work. Impressionism undoubtedly defied the traditions of European art. By doing so, it pushed the boundaries of artistic freedom and forever changed the way we define art.
Okay, so that gave you a lot of images to look at, as those always do, and hopefully gave you even more understanding of what these Impressionist paintings look like. I don't know if you noticed, but sometimes they'll pop up one that doesn't really look like the rest of them, and that's interesting. I think if you get the general idea of Impressionism does typically look this way. It's a style and a subject matter. And then sometimes you'll see an artist that just did it a little differently, and it doesn't have quite the loose style, and it's more about what it's about, and they're still considering themselves Impressionists or in that group, but it just doesn't quite look the same, and that's okay. So don't be confused by that. So as the video explained, the next art movement is post-impressionism, just means coming after the Impressionists. And what they were doing was getting away from that realistic looking imagery. They were pushing the boundaries just a little bit more. This refers to a diversity of artists that came after Impressionism. They are characterized by bright palettes and direct painting techniques. In other words, just really directly painting right onto the canvas. Not a lot of prep and planning beforehand. It's more expressive. They do go different directions even more. So you'll see a variety of looking art, but it all is grouped together as this post-impressionist style. Still everyday subject matter, still really looking at light and color, still showing brushstrokes, but you'll see it just kind of takes a different direction. It gets a little more, as the next one says, personal and abstract. So a little more of their heart is going into it, you could say, versus just recording what they see, like the Impressionists were. And then that abstraction. If you remember what that word means, it means getting further from something looking totally realistic. So one artist used, or more than one, but one in particular is a master and was a master of this pointillism technique that we're going to look at. It's a form of Impressionism developed by the artist Seurat. Dots and dashes of color are optically blended when viewed. So the artist does not blend them on the canvas. They are blended in your eyes. And this is the painting. I'm not sure why it's so small. I guess it needs to have more pixels. But this, his very famous painting, A Sunday on La Granja, 1884. This is, you've probably seen it before, or you've probably seen various people doing this image using different characters, or I've seen one where they use the Office characters and put them in the places of these people. So there's been some comical things done about this, but it's just, it's a well-known painting, and it's a big painting. It's very large, wall size. It is all done with dots. So Seurat was almost obsessive, very mathematical with his painting and calculating of what dots next to what dots create what color. I call this optical visual mixing. So the colors mix in your eyes. They are not mixed on the palette. So if you are on the canvas. So if you could zoom in on a piece of this, like where you see maybe this yellowy green right here, that is a series of green dots next to yellow dots, next to white dots with maybe a few blue dots mixed in. Where you go over here and there's only a few green dots, it's mostly dark blue dots, dark green dots, maybe some red dots. And when you step back, all those colors are mixing together in your eyes to create what you see. And that is called pointillism. I just clicked over here to a Google image search so you could see. Take a look at these. This is what it looks like if you were up close. This is what it looks like if you're even really close. This isn't necessarily Syrah. I just Googled it, so there's a bunch of different things. But this one is. This is Syrah. This is Syrah. You can see what the technique of pointillism is. It is just has to be extremely time consuming creating all these dots. They're just thousands and thousands, millions and millions of dots that come together to make a certain color. And dots, dashes, but not solid coloring, not solid painting, I should say, with broad areas. So anyway, that just kind of shows you how it looks up close a little bit better. So anyway, I think that's helpful to see it up close and see what pointillism is. And this is something that, you know, kids do in school and different people do as art projects to try to understand how to visually mix color together. It's very scientific. It's very, like I said, calculated. This is an artist we'll be looking at later, Chuck Close. And he has an interesting version of pointillism. He kind of does a grid system and he puts these different colors together. And so we'll be looking at him later too. Okay, back to our slides. These are a couple or three other examples of post-impressionism, and I want you to see them. I did it on purpose, this collage, so you can see how different they are. And you throw in Syrah with this, and you've got four very different, what we would call styles, right? The way they're painting is very different. They don't look like they've been painted by the same artist. But that's okay. Post-impressionism includes that. The subject matter is kind of still the same. Ordinary, everyday scenes, right? A landscape, some people doing their thing. But the emphasis, again, is on the color and the light. And there is a definite expressive quality to it. So we are now pushing the boundaries even more of what's acceptable as art, what's considered okay, what's considered good technique. And keep in mind, as these get a little more and more abstract as we go, these artists could draw very realistically if they wanted to. If they wanted to make a highly realistic painting, they could. It's not that they weren't as talented as the neoclassic artists. They were choosing to push these boundaries a little bit. This one is by Gauguin. This one is by Paul Cézanne, and this one is by Vincent van Gogh. Okay, and then the next time period we're looking at is called the avant-garde, and a French term originally referring to the detachment of soldiers that went first into battle. You may have heard that term before as a military term, but for artists, it referred to the battle of advancing the progress of art against the resistance of conservative forces. And this is where artists really start to liberate themselves and be free. A lot of this freedom comes from the invention of the camera, if you think about it. Now that we are able to, in the 19th and the 1800s, I think, I'm not sure the date of the camera being invented, but it was 1800s, definitely in the 1900s. If you needed a portrait, you could just take a portrait. If you needed to photograph landscapes, you could. So there wasn't as much need for artists to just very realistically render what was in front of them. There was more freedom. And again, modern world that we talked about before, it's just not the same world as the 17th century. There's just more freedom to explore, be creative, come up with new ways to do things. And art is no exception. So they were advancing in what was permitted and acceptable in the art world. So I don't want you, this isn't necessarily a time period, avant-garde. It's more like a new way of thinking about art. It's a group of artists who just sort of were determined to break the boundaries. And you go through art movements very quickly at this point. They pick up speed. They go even faster. So sometimes, like I said, they're just a 10-year period of time where people are trying this new art style. And so within the avant-garde, which within this new way of thinking and pressing forward to break the resistance of conservative forces, you have some of these other time art movements. Fauvism and Expressionism are the next two. So you want to make sure you understand the characteristics of both of these. We'll talk about Fauvism first. In 1903, a group of young artists, later called Fauves, founded the Salon des Autonomes, I can't say that, as a progressive alternative to the Salon. So again, we still have the Salon in Paris, and it's still very strict and it's still very stuffy. And we have these young artists pushing out of that. And so they created their own salon, their own salon. Characteristics of Fauvism. The freeing of color. We've talked about color back when we were talking about the elements of art. And so these artists just took color as such an independent, expressive tool in itself. It was definitely the focus of their art was the element of color. Feelings are more important than objective observation. So recording something as it looks is not nearly as important to them. We get much more abstract with this style. We get much more what would be further from realistic looking, more expressive and more bold, pushing the boundaries. This is Henri Matisse. You may have heard of Matisse before. He did a variety of styles. Some of his things were like paper cuttings, where he would cut out these kind of amoeba-like shapes out of paper, different colors, and arrange them almost like it was like collage work. But he also did painting, such as this one, Woman with a Hat. As you can see, he could draw. The woman is there accurately. She feels real in space, but he is just pushing the boundaries of what colors are acceptable and used, and freeing the color, as the Fauves said they were doing. Make sure you're getting these down. And then we have a couple other examples. You don't need to get these down. These are just to give you visual examples of Fauvism and Expressionism. So the top one is Fauvism. The name of this artist leaves me at the moment. I think I'm not for sure. The one on the right is an example of Expressionism. So I put them side by side because I want you to see how they jump even from Fauvism, which seems pretty outlandish. I mean, those people look pretty strange, right? They're starting to look kind of swirly twirly. Their faces are orange and some green on their faces. It's pretty abstract. It's pretty far from realistic, right? Well, the Expressionists, the next art movement, pushed it even further to what we would call non-representational, where it's just so abstract that it's not a picture of anything. It's just using those elements of art: line, color, texture, rhythm, repetition, line, value, using those elements to create works, all based on expression, personal expression, not intentionally looking like anything. Next, we have Cubism. I'm sure you've heard of Cubism's most famous artist, and that is Picasso. So Cubism characteristics are fragmenting the figures and other elements into flat planes. It's breaking the surface up so you're not having to see something from any one particular angle necessarily. It's flattening things, it's making them into flattened shapes and planes, but also changing the viewpoint. So basically breaking the rules of what is a realistic observation. It's seeing all things there from one angle. So seeing the back side of something along with seeing the front side of something. And this is just one example of Cubism. I'm going to go back real quick. I think the video talked about this. Cezanne was a leader into Cubism. So he just really looked at the structure of things and thought about the forms themselves. And forms are three-dimensional objects. So how is that form like a pyramid, and how can it be broken up into different pieces? We call it making things having facets. Like a diamond has different facets on it, the way they're cut. It's artists really starting to think about the structure of things and how to view it from different facets and angles. This one is still, we can recognize it. It looks in proportion, and the general drawing is realistic, where Cezanne eventually gets into very broken and Cubist style paintings. He really was the father of Cubism, was Cezanne. And then also George Braque, this one. His are another style of Cubism, but the same idea. You can see these are so different, but they're similar in how they're making things into planes, making them into facets, making them into sections, seeing it all from odd perspective, seeing the side and the front at the same time. And in the case of George Braque, his is like to the point where you can't tell what it is anymore. Like, what is that? Where this one, Picasso, you can still see what it is. It's obviously a portrait, and the title tells us the weeping woman, so she's sad. So I hope you can see the progression. Like it's artists, and these are all people we started out talking broad term. You know, we were all of Europe, a large span of area, different countries, and we've sort of narrowed down now to where we're focusing primarily in France, Spain, some. And in some point in this lecture, the art capital, you could think of it, moved from Italy to Paris, where it was, the capital of Italy was, or the capital of art was in Florence, Italy. That's where all the good art came from. It just sort of shifted to being in, I shouldn't say all the good art, but all the prestigious art, a lot of it came from all over Europe, but a lot was thought of as the capital in Florence. Well, it's shifted at some point to where Paris, France became the headquarters of the art world. And now, in modern days, it would be New York City will be considered like the art capital. So it's a quick run through, and I know just seeing a few images doesn't solidify it in your brain, but if you can just kind of get the basic characteristics of each of these time periods, it's helpful. So Cubism, we've talked about that. And now fantasy and futurism. New artistic innovators believed that art would only move forward through exploring new subjects. Futurists decided that motion itself was the new glory of the 20th century and sought to depict it in their art. Bacoini was one of the futurist artists. Bassioni. Sorry, I guess that's how you say that, Bassioni. And here's some examples of that. This is his sculpture called Forms of Continuity in Space. And then, I'm sorry, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. And I just stuck a couple other examples of futurism in here as well. So if you remember one thing about futurism, futurists, it's all about motion. Okay, that's the big key with futurists. They thought motion was just going to be the thing. And if you recall, when we learned the elements and principles of art, the element of time and motion was not added until the 21st century. So these guys were pushing motion as being a really big deal, but it didn't actually solidify as a foundational art element until the 21st century. But this is probably the precursor for it. And you can see they're just trying to, whether sculpture, this is a sculpture, by the way, this is like a brass sculpture, whether sculpture or painting, these two are paintings, you really get the essence of movement and motion. So they were pushing the future and thinking, what is going to take us there? And they believed motion was the key. Now, we didn't really talk about fantasy, but that's kind of, this was just a really brief little snippet. There aren't a ton of artists in this category, but just know that's basically the central fact in it is motion, movement and motion. New subjects, new subject matter. Okay, and then now we're moving on to World War I and after. So this is where what happens in the world and wars and battles really coincides with what we see in art. Dada was a protest art movement that literally meant anti. It started in protest against World War I and the aftermath of society. You know, just like we see today with protests and things against wars and what seems to be injustice, and that's our human way. We want to stand up for what's wrong in the world, right? We want to try to correct that. And so artists are always, not always, but oftentimes on the front lines of that, trying to see the better way of things, trying to stand up for the underdog. And so this was against World War I, anti everything. And this is going to be hard to get your mind around because it's a very strange time period for art. Anti everything. War, art, middle class, politicians, good manners, business. It's not a style, but a way of life. It's just like a culture of people that said, we're going to reject everything. Some of the most controversial works to come out of the Dada period were called ready-mades. Ready-mades were invented by the artist Duchamp, and artworks he did not create but designated as works of art. So he did not make these things. He just said, boom, it's art. Because I say it is, it is. So if you thought we were pushing the boundaries of what art is before, you're going to really see that now as we push into this time period. I'll give you a second to get all those things down. So make sure you understand Dada is an art movement. It protested against World War I and the aftermath of society. It's against everything. War, art, middle class, politicians, good manners, business, not a style, but a way of life. And a type of Dada art is ready-mades. So here's an example of a ready-made. You may recognize it. It's Duchamp's Fountain, 1917. And it is what it looks like. It's actually a urinal. And he actually signed it with a pseudo name, R. Mutt, as you can see. So he didn't even sign it with his own name, but he put his signature on it as if to claim it as his own work. And plop, there it is in an art gallery. So you can see why we've kind of headed to a strange place of how is that art? I know that's the question, but it becomes like a art sometimes when you push it this far becomes like a almost like a talking point rather than what the art is. It's almost like a discussion point or a jolt that they're trying to get from their audience. And he would claim, as many of these Dada artists would, they don't care what people think. They don't care themselves. They don't care what people think. They don't care what we think. But somehow I think that's impossible to not have any perspective or care at all. Similarly, with this thinking of anti-everything, we have the birth of surrealism. Similar in that it is a rejection of the world, a rejection of what you see in front of you. Similar in that they both are because of a war, the World War I, and how it affected culture and society. And so they both are deeply philosophical art movements, I think, that show when people have gone through something as horrific as a war like this, the reaction is strange when we look at it outside of context. But when we're looking at it in the context of that these people have lived through a war and they have some trauma, it makes a little more sense. So surrealism was inspired by Sigmund Freud. Appreciated the logic of dreams, mystery of the unconscious, the bizarre, the irrational, and the marvelous. Diving in headfirst to all of those topics and exploring. Subject defines surrealism, not style. So this is kind of like what we've talked about before. The style is going to change dramatically from artist to artist. What it looks like in general, how they used color, shape, style, texture, all those things is going to be very different. But the subject being particularly that it's very psychological. It's oftentimes about the unconscious or the out of this world. That's what unifies surrealism. And also that it's a result of war. So you perhaps have heard of Salvador Dali and perhaps have seen this one. This is a very famous, well-known painting of his titled The Persistence of Memory, 1931. And Dali was very well known for creating scenes of his dreams with repeated themes in them. Oftentimes this sort of amoeba head person would be in his artwork. Oftentimes a beach scene like this would be in his artwork. So he would have repeated things, and he often painted in this very formally realistic as far as like, okay, that tree has shadows and highlights. The clock even has shadows and highlights. It's a believable thing. The mountains in the background are painted realistically. So it has realistic elements, but put together in a very strange, almost eerie way to create these images. So remember, surrealism is about the unconscious or the subconscious. So when people dream, these surrealist artists would have been very interested in that, like diving into what did you dream? What is how can we get out of reality? How can we get out of the conscious world? If you think about that, when you've lived through a war, that makes sense. You want to escape to a different place. And so that's what Dali was famous for, his dream paintings, where these two artists, these are very different, aren't they? This top one, an artist named Jean Miro, he was focusing on what's called automatism. And that is trying to not think of anything and then just painting whatever comes out, like non-thinking painting. So in other words, it's trying to get into your subconscious while you're awake, like allowing your brain just to pour out whatever's in it, deep in the holes and recesses of it, without trying to actually think or plan or engage in it in your conscious state. So is that possible even to do? Probably not, but that's what that goal of automatism was. And not many, but a few different artists painted in this way using automatism. Miros often look similar. Sometimes they're not this combobbled with so much stuff. Sometimes they're just a few squiggly lines and a few spheres, but oftentimes these same symbols come up in his artwork. And he actually put this one into a room. As you can see, all these floating crazy things are in a space. This other one, I believe this one is by Rene Magritte, a well-known surrealist artist. He did some sculpture, some paintings as well. And this one is like entitled Furry Cup and Saucer or something like that. It's very obvious. So it's just pretty obscure, like crazy idea. Like you would not want to drink anything out of a furry cup, would you? Or stir it with a furry spoon. It's just kind of yucky to think about. But that just kind of the odd and unusual is also a characteristic of surrealism. Okay, and then this is the last section, which is kind of a vague time period, but it's more of like a school. The De Stijl and Bauhaus sought to create harmony between individuals and modern industry and technology. The artist Mondrian was the leader of this movement. He believed that vertical and horizontal elements and primary colors created rational beauty and balance in the world. So it kind of goes back again to these very formal things of primary colors, rational thinking, and this school of thought. Just think of it that way. If you focus on the one artist, Mondrian, it kind of helps you get a visual for the thinking behind this Bauhaus. It's creating, like it says, harmony or blending together of art with industry and technology, where oftentimes those are separated, right? Oftentimes the art world just seems very different from the business world and the industrial world and technology. They just don't always go together. I guess technology goes well with computers and all the graphic design that is now the art world as well. But at this time, they were very, very isolated, separated. And so he's trying to bring together these two things. And taking a look at his artwork here, Pierre Mondrian, I think you can see how he's using these elements of horizontal and vertical, simplified color palette, mathematical type looking structure, and he's trying to bring that together. He's trying to bridge this way of thinking. The school was actually founded in Germany, and Bauhaus can be loosely translated to building house. And so its leaders are trying to build new guiding principles of design compatible with the 20th century. So I guess they're like trying to update, the art world to be compatible with the rest of the world, both in technology, development, all those types of things. And then we have the Harlem Renaissance. This is the next time period, which will blend over into our next chapter. I'm just going to show you one example from this time period. Maybe I guess I won't be showing you any more in the next lecture, but the Harlem Renaissance was the merging of three American experiences. It's a really interesting study if you want to dive into it more, of the type of artwork that came from this. And you have African heritage, the legacy of slavery, and the realities of modern urban life. There is no single style associated with artists of the Harlem Renaissance, but the work of the painter and illustrator Aaron Douglas is representative of the spirit and aspirations of the group. So let me show you the work of art of him. This is a great work of art. Douglas, who was born in Kansas, moved to Harlem in 1924 during the Harlem Renaissance. He gradually developed a style called geometric symbolism. He worked prolifically through the 20s, but is perhaps most noted for a series of murals done a few years later for the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. This series, called Aspects of Negro Life, our illustration shows the segment that Douglas called From Slavery Through Reconstruction. So looking close at it, we see over here on the right, you have a man here reading what would be the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which was an order that freed slaves in rebelling states. Light radiates from the document in concentric circles. You can see that coming out. It's the brightest here in the center. So that draws our eye to it. That's emphasis, right? Like we talked about before. So at the left, men are picking cotton in the fields. Over here, we see these men picking cotton. All of these men. We can actually see the cotton here in the foreground, right? Foreground, middle ground, background. Okay, so they're picking cotton there. And as members of the KKK loom up maliciously in the background. Okay, these are them back there riding the horses. Founded in the South at the end of the Civil War in 1865, the Klan terrorized newly freed African Americans in a bid to restore white supremacy. At the center, a man points towards the Capitol building. So here's what I see as the focal point, or the main point of emphasis, is this man. He's center in the picture, right? He's about halfway across. He's a different color. He's kind of the same as this guy, but he's a little bit warmer. So I think that also pulls your eye there. And then, of course, what's he holding in his hand here that really pulls our eye to it? And that is a voting ballot. And also light is radiating out of that. Voting rights had been granted to African Americans by constitutional amendment in 1870. However, they still were not secure when Douglas painted this mural. And he painted it in 1934. That's a long time, 64 years of not being able to actually vote. They would not be able to vote securely for over 30 more years past that. So not until the 1960s. Douglas painted his mural, and the Harlem Renaissance as a movement lasted only a decade. Its momentum was stopped by the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression of the 1930s. Aaron Douglas's vision of a better society was actually painted during the early years of the Depression as the dream of the Harlem Renaissance faded. It's nevertheless a vision of hope. And so that concludes our lecture for today. That brings us up to the 1930s, and next time we will pick up around 1940 with continuing with modernism and then on to postmodernism, and that will be the end of our span of art history.